Welcome you all officially tonight to the Story Circle. My name is Marina Vries Shearer, and I'm one of the hosts. Tonight I'm running the show on my own with my offsider Grant Mangan joining us tonight. Welcome to you, Grant. The Story Circle began because I and Grant often have questions for authors. I'm sure you've all had that experience where you've read a book and you think, what happened next? Where did they get that story from? What else don't I know? Is there another book coming? And my curiosity goes to the point where I would just love to hang out with the author and find out more information. And so that's what this virtual book club is all about, meeting the authors, asking questions, and finding out more about the process and the background story to their stories. Tonight, I'm delighted to be introducing you to Amanda Giorgis, who's moved from the UK to New Zealand and is the author of a large number of books, historical fiction, and you're going to hear all about her journey and the books tonight. Amanda lives in Airwell Forest in North Canterbury, Christchurch. I went to her house to meet her on Friday, and her house has beautiful views of the Southern Alps. And Amanda made a lovely batch of oat cookies straight out of one of her books, which was a lovely experience to have. We sat down and we had some great conversation about writing books, selling books, ancestry, family trees, and you're going to be in for a real treat tonight as she shares a lot of what she shared with me with you. So welcome, Amanda. Let's get started.
Hi, Marina.
You moved from England to New Zealand. Was writing historical fiction always a dream of yours, or was there something that happened in New Zealand that brought the stories out for you?
I suppose I've always written. The first thing that was published was something when I was 11 in the school magazine, a story about two mosquitoes who went to live in a dog's house. And as time goes by, I was working full time. So although there might be a book in my head, I never really had the time for it to come out. But it was me who always wrote reports or articles for magazines and things like that. So I've always kept my writing hand in, but it wasn't until I got to New Zealand and had a bit more time on my hands that a story came out. And it was after the earthquakes, we moved to Twizel in the Mackenzie Basin. Some of you will know how lovely it is. And it was there really that how can you not be inspired by the scenery there? It's spectacular, rugged, beautiful, changes with the weather. You can't avoid being inspired by it, really.
So it's pretty much the same where you are. You've got a very beautiful outlook where you are of the snow-capped mountains and you live on some acreage. How much does physical environment influence your writing? How important is it for
Oh,
you?
oh, it's really important. I'm a country girl. I need to be in the countryside to feel the weather, see the clouds, that sort of thing. I can't function in the city terribly well. I have to be somewhere where you can see a full sky if you like.
So your debut novel was The Wide Awake Hat, and it was apparently inspired by a visit to the Mackenzie Monument and the mysterious real life figure of James Mackenzie. Can you tell us about the moment when you decided that that piece of local folklore was going to become your first historical fiction saga?
There was a moment in time. You're absolutely right. And I can blame my friend Heather from England, who came to stay with us when we were living in Twizel. And she'd done a little bit of research before she came to us. And she'd fallen in love with the story of James Mackenzie. I don't know if you know his story. I expect you do if you're in the South Island. But he was accused of stealing some sheep, sent to prison, and then pardoned. And pretty much everybody assumed that he went to Australia after that. So we explored that story while Heather was staying with me, and I took her for a picnic to the Mackenzie Monument, which is in the Mackenzie Pass, off the beaten track somewhat. Beautiful place with a sort of obelisk with the story of James Mackenzie written in Gaelic, Maori, and English on the three sides of the obelisk. We had our picnic in the sunshine. It was a day that wasn't windy, which is unusual up there. And when we'd eaten, we went for a wee walk, just along an old track. We didn't really know where we were going. We were wandering. And we came across a little grove of trees with the obvious remains of a stone building. And Heather, being Heather, said, "This is where James Mackenzie lived." And on the way home in the car, we spun a bit of a yarn about it. And over a glass of wine that evening, we spun the yarn even more. Heather went home, and I don't know quite what made it happen, but something went click in my head, and I started to write what I thought happened to James Mackenzie after he was pardoned. And I'm not going to spoil it for you because you need to read the book to find out what I thought became of him. Let's say that, in my view, he stayed in New Zealand, and he went on to star in 9 of the 10 books so far.
And congratulations for selling 8 books today. I had that little preview of information from
Yes,
you before we went live. It's always
yes,
exciting.
that's unusual.
Book.
Yep, that's lovely when somebody buys a whole set of the first series. That gives you quite a boost. So anyway,
Right.
I wrote a chapter of that book before I told anybody. I was quite embarrassed about writing somehow. But I wrote a chapter, eventually sent it to Heather, who wrote an email back to me. The title was "Dear Aspiring Famous Author," which I've kept that email. And slowly I let people know, and slowly I wrote the book over a period of about 4 or 5 months, I suppose.
It's lovely to have friends who support us in the writing journey.
Absolutely. I couldn't have done it without Heather, to be honest with you. She still edits my books and comes up with suggestions all the time.
That's wonderful. Well, let's talk about how you put your stories together and where you find the information. I know that you're a fan of the Otago Settlers Museum. So
Oh, yes.
what part has that, or what part has that place had to play in your story journey, the gathering of information?
So when I first started writing the book, I intended my 2 protagonists to come into Christchurch by ship from Scotland, from Glasgow. But I visited the Settlers Museum in Dunedin, and it's such a rich research background that I decided to switch it so that they actually came into Port Chalmers. In those days, there was no pier in Port Chalmers, so they had to get into little boats to come into. And then they walked all the way up as far as the Waitaki River over a period of well over a week, met the Waitaki River, which was in flood, so headed inland because they couldn't possibly cross it. All of the information that informed me of that part of their journey comes from the Settlers Museum, really. And they built a little house, Sophia and George. And if you visit the Settlers Museum, you will see exactly Sophia's house. You can even hear her singing a song in the background. So rich pickings in that museum, and it changes all the time. We go back and find out new things all the time.
I was there
Um,
last weekend and absolutely found it divinely rich for a history-loving gal,
mhm.
particularly the room with the images of all of the different settlers
Yeah, oh,
that
it's
room.
lovely. Isn't it? It's
Mm.
lovely. You can sit and look on the screen and get the background story to all the portraits that they've got. It's a super place. Um, where else do I get my information from? Well, you always need the kind of practical stuff when you're writing. So you need to know how much it costs to buy a horse or how much a half a pound of butter is, or all that sort of thing. And I get all of that from the Statistics NZ yearbooks, annual yearbooks. The easiest way to find that is just to Google New Zealand 1905 or whatever you're looking for, and it'll come at the top of the list on Google. Absolutely rich with information that you kind of need to know to include in the story. I picked one out just to share with you tonight from 1904-5, which is what I'm dealing with at the moment in my current book. It's about sheep, which I thought you might find interesting. There were 18 million sheep in New Zealand in 1904. 18 million.
Wow.
9 in the North Island and 9 in the South Island, funnily enough. They were paid 17 shillings and sixpence for 100 fleeces, which doesn't sound all that much, really, does it?
No.
And most merino sheep would provide £7 of fleece, which is pretty good, isn't it? I don't, and it generated £4.6 million in 1904 for the New Zealand economy. The other thing that's interesting, because I've written a little bit about the freezer ships, and if you go to Totara, which is also down the other side of Oamaru, you'll see the story of the freezer ships. We ended up sending nearly 5 million carcasses to England in 1904. So on top of the fleeces, we also got an income from the sheep's carcasses that were frozen and carried over to England on freezer ships. So all that came from the New Zealand yearbooks. I recommend them if you want to be looking back on any year back to about 1840.
Amanda, has any historical document ever drastically changed a plot line for you?
Yes, one, but I can't honestly remember where I found it out. And it brings me on to dogs, because anybody that knows me or has read my stories knows that there are going to be dogs in there somewhere. And when I was doing my initial research into James Mackenzie, he has a famous dog called Friday. Friday's a girl. I suddenly found out, and I drafted out the first chapter of him Friday siring some puppies, but actually I had to quickly change it all around so that Friday actually had the puppies. And somehow in my head that made a really big difference, that she was a female dog rather than a male. I wish I could remember where I found it out from.
Grant and I were talking recently, and he shared with me about a book he knew of where the dog was a character who spoke and had opinions and thoughts. And I thought, how amazing. And then I found out that you've done the same thing. Your dogs are characters.
Yes, I have written one chapter through the eyes of the dog. I got some criticism for doing it from some people, but I think it was the right thing to do for Friday's story, because she was quite an exceptional dog. And I think I've made some of my dogs have sort of, what's the word, reckoning. So most dogs will, they'll see something and they'll do it. Some working dogs see something, do it, and think of the consequences of what they do. And that's how I've seen the dogs that I put into my books. I will say I do get a bit attached to my characters in the books, particularly to the dogs. And there was, when I had to write I think in book 3, that Friday died of old age in the arms of James Mackenzie, I cried when I was writing it. And yeah. I suppose you do that more for dogs than you do for people sometimes.
Yeah. An interesting point that I think we should raise here is that you might have got criticism from some people about using the dog as a character, but you're a self-published author, so there's no publisher changing or amending your script. You get to write exactly what you want. That's important to you, isn't it?
It is. I've got Heather, of course, in the background telling me when I get it wrong. But yes, that's exactly true. And that's partly why I wanted to self-publish. It's terribly arrogant of me to say that I wasn't prepared to wait to publish the books, and I wasn't really prepared to let a publisher change them greatly,
Mm.
because I think they're good as they are. It's terribly arrogant of me, and it's probably not the right way to look at it. But self-publishing does allow you to do that easily, as you're
Now,
finding out.
yeah. Now, James Mackenzie was supposed to be the legendary figure, but somebody came and usurped that. Sophia. Tell me
Yes.
her and the role that, what happened for you? How did Sophia kind of take over the story?
Well, there isn't a great deal known about James Mackenzie before he got to New Zealand. So there was not a great deal of point in me writing about his journey from Scotland to New Zealand. So I decided to start with somebody completely different, a young couple who live on the west coast of Scotland, who married the night before they sailed so that they could sail together. Completely fictional characters, Sophia and George. The names in my books all come from my family tree, but they're not real people. So, in order to get names that were suitable for that era, I go back through my own family tree and pick out appropriate names. And so I do have Sophia Nichols in my family history. So it wasn't long before I realised that I wasn't really writing a book about James Mackenzie at all. I was writing a book about Sophia and the women who came to New Zealand in that era, who were tough as old boots. You've got to admire them. Sophia had her first child under a cart, helped by her husband, who probably knew nothing about childbirth. And she brought the child up, and then James ended up in prison, and she had to survive without him for several years. It must have been a tough old life. And that sort of suddenly became the main element of my stories, really, is how these fairly ordinary women who did extraordinary things, despite wearing clothes with 7 petticoats and boots that you had to button up. It's, but I don't know that we would be tough enough to do it these days, would we?
Where did the name Applecross come from? It's the name of the series. Where did you get that name from?
So um, when James, what happened was that George was drowned. So Sophia was left as a widow. She met James and they fell in love. Excuse me. James went off to prison, and when he was pardoned and came back, they moved into what is now the Mackenzie Basin, and built themselves a new place with more sheep and started to build an empire in a way. A lot of the Mackenzie Basin is very Scottish already. A lot of Scottish names for some of the sheep stations. So I wanted a Scottish name that wasn't too Scottish. And Terry and I have often, when we were in England, visited the west coast of Scotland. It's a beautiful coastline, very much like New Zealand, with white sand beaches, and it's beautiful. But one of the small villages there is called Applecross, and I liked it because it wasn't too Scottish. So it fits in terribly well, and it's become sort of a bit of a brand name.
I've been fascinated with Scottish New Zealand history, and I've been to Scotland twice in the last 12 months and found out that 30%, sorry, yes, about 30% of New Zealand's first immigrants came from Scotland, and around 100,000 Scots left Scotland and split between America, New Zealand, and Canada.
Mhm.
So that accounts for our huge influx of Scottish people. And I know I've got them in my family, and I'm sure that there are many Kiwis who have a Scottish person in their family too. So the
Yeah,
story of James Mackenzie and the origins of the Scots in New Zealand is probably going to be quite special to a lot of Kiwis.
certainly if in the South Island and in Otago, because Dunedin is to all intents and purposes, back in the day, it was part of Scotland almost.
And I mean, Dunedin means Little Edinburgh.
Yep.
So I was at university in Dunedin and I had no idea what that meant because I'd never seen Edinburgh, but now I've seen Edinburgh, I can see
Big.
Dunedin. Yeah. So, moving from the 19th century frontier setting of the Applecross saga to the 20th century with your Strong Roots books, the series that explores the Edwardian era, how did the atmosphere and tone shift for you as a writer?
It's quite different, isn't it? The Edwardian era. The Victorians were very straight-laced, had quite a lot of rules about things. Things started to free up a little bit after Victoria died at the beginning of the 1900s. So it's quite exciting for me to be writing in a period when some of the women have more opportunities, perhaps, than they did in the first series. So yeah, and there's so much technology that's coming along in the beginning of the 1900s, planes, cars, telephones, all that sort of thing. It opens up the world so much more for my characters who lived quite small lives to begin with, because it was, several days trip to get out of the basin and go down to Timaru or Oamaru.
Mm.
Now they could get in a car and drive somewhere or telephone somebody, so there's lots of exciting things to come in the Edwardian era, I think.
So, is Strong Roots connected to Applecross?
Yes, yeah, very definitely. So I reached I reached a point where really I didn't want to take the story any further once James died. So instead of going off to some other family in some other part of the country, I decided to jump forward. It's just over 12 years and start the story of the next generation. Victorians had huge families, of course, so there were lots of children to choose from who, by the beginning of the 1900s, had grown up or were growing up and had their stories to tell. So that's kind of why there was a big gap.
So, the characters are fictional, their actions are fictional. What parts of the stories are true, Amanda?
So I always based my stories around what really happened in New Zealand. So, for instance, I'll give you an example of this. At the end of the first book in the second series, um, some of the characters go off to see the first aeroplane taking off in Timaru, or supposed first aeroplane taking off in Timaru. So that was a real event, but it was my fictional characters who went to watch it happening. And that's how I always try to do it, so that there's real stories there from history that interest people, but my characters are either watching it or taking part in it without changing it as much as I can.
You must be on the hunt for information constantly.
I'm a bit of a sponge for trivia, I suppose. So I think you have to be as a writer, and probably really have to be for historical fiction. You've got to absorb stuff. So the Settlers Museum is rich pickings for me, but I have a habit of tucking these things away in the back of my brain somewhere, and then they come out in a book a few years later or whatever. And I think that's probably one characteristic of all historical fiction writers. You've got to have that kind of brain that squirrels things away.
When we were together on Friday, I was curious about the family tree that you showed me, which looked like it was a historical family tree of perhaps your own family. But then I found out it's the family tree of the characters in your story. It must be hard keeping track of everybody over a multi-generation series of books. Can you tell us about that family tree and perhaps show
Yes,
us?
well, I've actually got a picture of it. It's a bit scribbled on. So those are my main fictional family. I don't know, you won't be able to see the detail, but I have to do that because Victorian families had so many children. The number of times I've said, if only they only had two, Life would be so much easier. Um, I refer to it, I mean, it's dog-eared and marked and written on because I use it all the time to work out who's who and how old they are. I have been known to marry off an 11-year-old or say that somebody who's 55 had a baby. And thank goodness for Heather for stopping me from making that into a published version.
Yeah, that was what Grant did for me when I got a few dates and events a
Yeah,
bit mixed up as well.
yeah. You do need somebody to sort of keep an eye on the continuity as well, so that you're not suddenly sitting down at the dinner table with an extra person who's just appeared from nowhere and things like that. Um, and that gets increasingly difficult with a lot of characters. And it is one downside of historical fiction that however you manage it, you're going to end up with quite a lot of characters to manage somehow.
Mm. So, what about when a chapter isn't flowing? Do you ever get writer's block and how do you manage your way through it?
I I'm not at all a disciplined writer. I wish I could be, up at 6 o'clock and do 2 hours of writing before breakfast, but I'm never going to be like that. I might leave it for 3 weeks and then come back and write for 4 days, pretty much non-stop. But I do get bogged down sometimes, and I do reach a point where I think I don't really know where to take this, and I walk away. I just walk away from it. I suppose I'm lucky that I can set my own deadlines, so gaps are fine. And usually, what happens is that I'll often in the bathroom in the morning as you're in the shower, or overnight, or out walking the dogs, I'll think, I know how I could do that. And I come back and cross out what I've done and start again. It just comes in fits and starts, really. I have a vague idea of what each book is going to cover, um, a beginning, a middle, and an end, but I don't always. The middle is not always what I expect it to be. Let's put it that way. Um,
Do you
my
ever
character,
dream about your books, Amanda? Do you ever dream? Do you ever have dreams where your stories are coming to life?
oh yes, all the time. Um, yes, my characters are real to me, and that sounds silly, but they are real people to me, which is why I don't have too much trouble remembering who they are and which children belong to whom and things like that. But yes, I do dream about them. And they have a habit of changing the storyline themselves in a way. So there are one or two characters who I introduced for a purpose, and they kind of put down roots and decided to stay. And I mean, one particular person, Guy, ended up having a book all of his own, and he was only supposed to pass through the basin, take a photograph of Friday the dog, and move on. But he's still with us in book 10. And in my head, he's a very handsome man and a very lovely gentleman.
Somebody's just asked, can you show us what one of your books looks like? Have you got a book just handy there?
Yes, I have. I've got book one, the first book. Now that's the printed version, and that's actually my husband on the front cover with one of our dogs, Jess. Um, so I had my books printed at the same place as yours, actually, in the first place. They've changed a little.
I think we've frozen. Amanda, are you still
Has
there?
changed. Sorry,
Oh, we just froze there for a moment. You're back.
that's the latest book. Not the new one just about to come out, but the latest one that is published. Um, and covers of books change with the fashions. So it's something when you write a lot of books, you just have to keep an eye on so that they are fitting in with other covers of the same genre. Um, there's a whole lesson to be had with book covers.
Mhm. So let's turn to your advice for other potential historical fiction authors. somebody who might be afraid of publishing a book or even starting a book, what would you have to say to encourage people who are tossing around the idea of whether to put their finger into the pie and have a wee crack at writing historical fiction?
I think I split that question into two, the writing and the publishing, which in a sense are two separate things. So from a writing point of view, I would say just get on and write. Just get on and put it down on paper. Because if you don't, nobody else will. And even if you do that and never go to the next step, you've done something worthwhile. So don't be discouraged by the fact that the average number of books that are sold on Amazon by any one person is 3. That's the reality of it. And when you think of all the millions of celebrity authors who sell lots of copies, 3 isn't very much as an average. But don't be downhearted by that. Just go on and do it. You might be the one that sells 3 million, for all you know. And make sure it's a book, not just an article or what would be like a women's magazine story. If you're going to write a story, make it a proper story. A novel has to be 50,000 words or above, which sounds quite daunting, but it's surprising if you've got a story to tell how quickly that number comes up. So just write. And I think if you're writing historical fiction, characters are important. So try to concentrate on the characters as much as the historical situation that you're setting it in. People say, when I ask people about my book, it's the characters they remember. And I think that's important. The historical setting is just fact, really, but the characters are the people that are dancing through your story. So concentrate on that as much as you can, I think. The publishing side of things, I can't really comment on the proper method of going via a publishing house. I've not done it. But from a self-publishing point of view, it is scarily easy to put an ebook copy of your book on Amazon. It takes 10 minutes. That doesn't mean to say it'll sell. And you probably do need a decent cover and a decent sort of write-up to put on the front. But just do it. It doesn't cost anything. Then you've got to learn how to market it. And that's probably the hardest thing. Most writers are quite introverted, and marketing is quite the opposite. And so the two don't sit very comfortably side by side. It's a bit I struggle with most, really. I just have to write. And that's what people say is if you're struggling to sell a book, write another one. Because people will see that you've got 2 books or 3 books or 10 books. And so you must be a decent author in that
Well,
case.
on that note, you are writing your 10th book at the moment, which is due out later this year. What do you see as the future for your stories? How many books are there in you?
I don't know the answer to that one quite, but when I started this process, I told everybody grandly that I would write 12 books and finish at the First World War. Um, I don't think that's going to happen. I think it's going to deviate from that a little bit. But there is another one after the one that is just about to be published. It's halfway through this writing this book. I made my mind up that there's one character who needs her story told. So she will have a book all to herself. That'll take us up to about 1908, something like that. So then we've got the First World War to cover. I may go on to the Second World War because it's an interesting part of New Zealand's history. And then probably, I do have a vague idea that I might jump to the 60s. For those of you that know the Mackenzie Basin, it's got a fantastic history in the 60s and 70s of the hydroelectric scheme building and so on. So there's potential there. I don't think I'm much of a writer of detective stories or horror stories or romance. They just don't appeal. So I think if I do keep writing, it will be historical fiction of some description. I leave the romance books to other people.
Amanda, if you could sit down with one of your characters and have afternoon tea, who would it be?
That's difficult. I want them all to sit down with me, really. Um, it would most definitely be in Sophia's farmhouse kitchen, a wooden kitchen table with a range going behind us. And it would be tea and oat cakes, as you found on Friday. Um, when you asked me this a day or two ago, I ended up with all the men at the table, which is quite worrying. So we had James and we had his father. I'm trying not to do spoilers here. We had his father at the table, who incidentally is called Captain Shepherd, and saved his role for Sam Neill to play. So I'm quite sad now that when they make the film version, she said grandly, I can't have Sam Neill as Captain Shepherd, sadly. Um, and George, who was drowned, I think he'd be there. Of course, Sophia. And there were one or two other female characters who had. Oh, Guy would have to be there. The one who should have taken the photograph. And some of the ladies. Lucy is a character in the first 3 or 4 books, who is the reason that some of the English birds came to New Zealand in my head. She brought caged birds on the ship with her when she emigrated from England, and they were let free, shall we say. So that's why there are skylarks in the Mackenzie Basin in my storyline. So she was a character, and Betsy, who runs the village shop, she's sort of a bit of a sticky beak, but she knows everything that's going on, and she would be good value at the dining table, I think.
I didn't tell you this, but when I was reading this book, I had a little bit of a giggle because an organ arrives as a gift from Sophia's father. Trying not to do a spoiler here myself. Sorry, I'm not going to speak more about the organ, except to say when I went to university in Otago, I turned up at a church and they said, "Can you play the organ?" And I said, "I can play the piano, and we've got an organ at home, and I can, you know." Roughly
Okay.
play the organ. And so the minister of the church said, "Oh, we'd love to have you play the organ." And I thought they were absolutely desperate and they had nobody to play the organ. So I thought that I was doing a really good turn for the church. But there was a very angry 80-year-old woman sitting in the first row. And the first time I played the organ, she came up to me afterwards and was very, very cross because she'd been the organist up until when I arrived and they'd retired her for a younger model. And
Oh
so
dear.
when I read the piece about the organ arriving and Sophia going to practice, it reminded me of heading down to practice while I was studying at university.
There's a wee surprise in the latest book about Sophia's father, who actually wrote music for the music hall. And that story comes back to haunt us in the latest book. I won't, no spoiler alerts.
Now, on a different tangent, what's one historical fiction novel by another author that you have absolutely loved and would love to have written yourself?
Can I have more than one, please?
Sure.
Um, I mean, the obvious ones are people like Lucinda Riley in the Seven Sisters books, which is sort of dual timeline, but contains such a rich variety of stories, really. Um, Back in the day, I used to binge on Rosamund Pilcher as well, the Shell Seekers and a series. They were very 80s kind of books, but I enjoyed those. But surprisingly enough, it's two male authors that really probably influenced me more than anything. Um, the Poldark series by Winston Graham has been a favourite of mine forever. And that's about strong women. It's not about Ross Poldark at all. It's Demelza that everybody remembers, and Elizabeth. And I think I I kind of caught that from the Poldark books. Um, But the one author that's probably influenced me more than anything is R.F. Delderfield, and he's not a particularly popular author these days. But he wrote the one that most of you might know is To Serve Them All My Days. It was made into a television series back in the 70s. But he wrote a series of books under the heading God is an Englishman, which is a terribly old-fashioned title. But they're very similar to my stories, with strong characters, strong women. And basically, there's a story of a chap who found a very expensive jewel and took it home and built a transport enterprise. And it goes all the way from horse and cart through canals, trains, and trucks. But it's not him, you remember, it's his wife and the two or three women who worked for him and things. They're the storyline. And I think he probably had more influence than anybody. He had a knack of laying the foundations of a location down, but it was the characters that drove the story along. It sounds very obvious to say, but I think it's a really important part of story writing, is that the characters are the people that tell you the story, not the location or the backgrounds.
Let's shift to how people can find your books because they're not in the regular bookshops. Can you talk to us about the options, please?
Okay, so the options for paperbacks. Emma's bookshop in Oxford sells my books, which is very kind of them. Apart from that, you can get paperbacks through my website, which I think Marina is going to share somewhere.
There
Wonderful.
we
So everything that you need to know about me is on the website somewhere. So, but there's a link for buying the paperbacks directly from me, and I'm going to do it for postage free for a little while as part of the deal from tonight's talk. If you read ebooks, then all of my books are on Amazon as ebooks, and they're both subscribed. You can subscribe to read them pages at a time. You know the monthly subscription, or you can actually buy them that way as well. They're very reasonable as ebooks, if that's your thing. And I do have an audiobook version of book one, which I think Marina, you listened to some of.
I
I've
did.
I put it on YouTube, and there's a link from my website to that as well. I had a professional narrator do book one, and Sue did a really good job. She had to tackle English, Scottish, Gaelic, Maori, and some German, and she managed to do all of them extremely well. So it's a really good version of book one if you're listening is your thing.
Thank you, Amanda. Well, I want to open it up now to our guests in the room with us and find out if anybody has a question for Amanda. You can either come off mute or you can type it into the chat. So we're going to throw it open to the floor now and give you, how long have we got? We've got 15 minutes. So we've got plenty of time for plenty of questions. So who's got a burning question that they'd like to put to Amanda? Please feel free to let me know what that question is now.
Everybody's gone quiet.
I would just like to say hello to Amanda.
Hi, Pat. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. I was so excited to hear that you were going to be on here, and I have just loved listening to you speak. I don't know if anyone's noticed, but I've been nodding my head like that, like one of those nodding dogs in a car, because so many things that you've said are things that all of us authors experience, I think. And it's been fascinating, Amanda. Thank you. And I think I've only read two or three of your books, so I need to get my socks, my no, not mine, pull my socks up and
Likewise.
read some more, I think, yes. But thank you so much. It's been really fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat.
Thank you, Pat from Auckland.
You're very welcome.
Mhm. Anybody else got a question? Let me open my chat up and see if anybody else has a question. We have Joe McDonald with us tonight who's currently at Bangkok Airport. So
Wow.
that's a good way to get through some of that wait time between flights.
Yeah.
Okay. No more
Anybody-
questions, Amanda? Yes, I think we've got another question just come in. Can Amanda tell us a bit about her childhood and if anything started her writing? Thank you, Tracy.
Well, that's an interesting question, Tracy. I had a very ordinary childhood, really, in a little country village in the southwest of England, in Somerset. But I suppose I was lucky that my parents both encouraged a lot of reading. I read prolifically, even if it was only Enid Blyton mostly. I just read and read and read. If nobody could find me, I was in a corner with a book somewhere. And it was a good place to grow up. It was, and nature was a big part of life. I grew up knowing about birds and trees and plants and things because of where we lived. And that's carried forward, I think, into my writing too. Of course, everything had to be kind of relearned when we came to New Zealand. Even the sky is upside down, which took me a while to get my head around. But it's something that's always been with me. I think when you grow up in the country, you're more aware of the weather and more aware of the seasons and things like that. And that probably shows up in my books to some extent. I went to a secondary school that was an all-girls grammar school, very old-fashioned, berries in the winter and boaters in the summer. And I went straight into teaching as soon as I left school. I didn't last very long as a teacher. It's too hard. But that's my life, really.
To anybody who thinks they need to go to university and get a degree in English before they can start writing, what would you have to say to them, Amanda?
I guess it might help. I certainly didn't do so, although I did A-level English, so sort of top school level. I think the key to it is that you read widely. I think the more you read, the better. It doesn't really matter what it is, but you learn by reading what works. And I think it's like a lot of things. When you write a book, you start reading books in a different manner altogether because you start looking at the construction of them and the language of them. But I don't think it matters as long as you're reading, because you learn so much from what other people do. Some of the things you learn that you don't like. So that's just as important as what you do like, I guess.
Reading widely. Thank you for that tip.
Absolutely. Or listening, if you haven't got time to read, of course.
Grant Mangan, who's with us tonight, he's my co-host. He has an entire library in his house of books. So no shortage of reading material in Grant's home. Grant, do you want to come off mute? I'm sure that's a burning question for Amanda.
Well, yeah, I have actually, and it relates to the comment you made earlier on, Amanda, about how you a lot of the names of your characters are fictional, but a lot of the names are names that you've discovered in your own family tree. And so I was very interested in that comment, because I thought, well, you say the characters are fictional, but has it been tempting for you, since you're using names of your own family, to actually look back into your family tree and say, oh, well, that ancestor was really interesting. I wonder if I can weave in some of their personality or their characteristics or some of the things they got up to and evolve that into a character. Obviously in a different setting, because you're from England and your family are presumably in England. And so you're moving them to New Zealand. But was it, has it been tempting to kind of make it more sort of autobiographical in that sense?
Not really. I took the names because they would be appropriate for the time period. That's basically, I just did a filter on my family tree of the 1800s and picked names randomly from it. But I have done quite a lot of my family history research. And my surname is Swiss. So my grandfather on my father's side was Swiss. And there's a big hole in that part of my family tree because the records are very difficult to get hold of without going to Switzerland. And I've never been, which is a terrible thing to admit. But yes, so there are characters in my family tree who might turn into a story, but I don't think they've got enough story to turn into something you would want to publish, really. They're fairly ordinary people, all from the same part of England, all doing fairly tedious jobs, as far as I can tell. There's one or two exciting bits. I found out that my mother's first husband, who was killed in the war, they'd only been married for 9 months. He crashed his plane into a house as he was landing somewhere in Lincolnshire in England, on the east side. I found out fairly recently that the house that he crashed into was populated by somebody from my father's side of the family. So my mother's side of the
Really?
family killed somebody from my father's side, long before they met, obviously. So there's a story that could be told there, but it's not a book. It's just a paragraph, really.
Oh, I think that'd make a wonderful short story. I mean, I love that twist. That's fabulous, isn't it?
Yeah, that's the more you look into anybody's family history, the more little anecdotes you find like that.
Amanda, you have a fan in the room. Sharon has come in at 3:30 a.m. from Michigan. And
My
she said,
goodness,
I
Sharon, well
know.
done.
Says, I'm really enjoying this discussion on your writing process and asks, do you write other genres like poetry?
I don't really, although it has crossed my mind occasionally that poetry would be quite a nice way to go, really, because almost anything goes, doesn't it? So it would be a way of putting your feelings down on paper, in a sense. That's sort of somewhere in the back of my mind that's tucked away for one day when I feel like it. I did win as a child. I won a national poetry competition. Sadly, I can't remember what it was, what I'd written, or what I won. But yeah, maybe one day. You never know.
We have Joe Emson in the room who said, thank you, Amanda. I have loved your books. They are so real.
Oh,
Nice.
that's nice. That's the sort of comment that I like to have because they're real to me as well. And they're the best kind of readers. Thank you.
I'm curious to know whether most of your readers are New Zealand-based people or whether your stories have an international appeal.
Most of my ebooks are sold in America.
Oh, okay.
And the comments I get are about frontiers people and pioneers and things like that. So the setting might be different, but I suppose the story is quite similar to the move to the West by the pioneers of America. A lot of people in England, of course, because that's where a lot of my family still is. A few in Australia. All over the place, really. But from the paperback point of view, it's kind of more in New Zealand because that's where the sales are easiest to make, really.
Thank you. And Nicola, would you like to come off mute and talk to Amanda?
Thank you, Marina. Good evening, everyone. Hello, Amanda. Thank you so much. It's been so fascinating. I'm interested in understanding, you said you wrote a chapter. What's your process? Are you doing redrafting while you're writing, or do you tend to write a whole lot and then do an editing process over a few? Or, would you be able to describe that for us, please?
So I generally do a chapter at a time. I then send it to my friend Heather, who acts as my editor in England. And she takes commas out and puts commas in and tells me when I've spelt something wrong and all that sort of level of editing. And then when the whole story is written, I run through it. I let the computer talk it to me because you'd be surprised how often that shows up mistakes or missing words or double words. So that's my bit of editing before it goes to Heather. She has it printed out and works on the printed copy and does the sort of final overall edit. And that's when we discuss the order of things or bits that are irrelevant that need to be taken out or extra bits that need to be put in. So that's the process. So there's a lot of toing and froing between me and Heather via email while I'm writing, but generally it's a chapter at a time. My chapters tend to be quite short. I do that on purpose, really, because it's sort of, you're moving from one scene to another more than you think you're going to. So at the moment, Heather's got my latest book, which is due out in the middle of September, and I can't do anything. I get frustrated because it's with her, and I mustn't touch it, otherwise my copy is out of step with hers. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
That's lovely, thank you. And interesting that you listened to it. I hadn't predicted that. So yeah, that's a useful
It's really useful.
addition.
It's surprising what it shows up. Some of the pronunciation by the computer is a bit odd. It doesn't seem to be able to manage Sophia for some reason, but you get used to that.
I found the same thing and
you.
decided that it's going to be one of my the first thing that I do is read my own book out loud because I'm hearing sentence structure that needs to change. So that was something that I learned along the way as well.
Works well.
Our time is up, so thank you so much for being with us. The link is in the chat if anybody would like to go and buy one of Amanda's books tonight. I've got 2 on the go at the moment, so thank you so much for that, Amanda. And for those of you who've joined us, thank you for taking the time to be part of the Story Circle tonight. We'll be back here in 2 weeks' time with Pat Buckley from Auckland, and we'll be talking about her writing journey, another prolific writer, and I'm looking forward to having Pat. But for tonight, thank you, Amanda. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Marina, for organising us.
You're very welcome. Good night, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.